lesson. Welcome to Mod 3 Style. Learn to Sew episode number 4. Today we're going to go over the final few things you need to know as you begin sewing. I'm going to start today by talking about the number one thing that will determine whether or not you end up being a skilled sewer. That number one thing is this little guy right here. It's called a seam ripper. A lot of my students sometimes refer to it as an unpicker. Its name is a seam ripper. It's this fabulous little tool, costs you only like $2 or $3. It is perfectly designed to remove stitches. But this tool's function isn't actually what will determine whether or not you are a skilled sewer. It is the way you think about this tool that will decide that. Most people, when they start sewing, they naturally think of sewing as a process, like a long walk. We start at point A and we want to get to point B. But in that thinking, any mistake you make is kind of like taking a step backwards. And that can be incredibly frustrating. You feel like you're losing progress. You're going backwards, you're wasting time, any mistake you make. Instead of thinking of sewing as a walk from point A to point B, over the years I've started to think of sewing more like a dance. And in a dance, steps forward, steps backward, and even steps to the side are all essential. In fact, steps backwards are actually a skill. I am hoping to convince you that unpicking is one of the most important skills that you can develop as a sewer. Time you spend fixing your mistakes is not a waste of time. It is actually time spent developing the skill of unpicking. I have personally become a fabulous unpicker, and it's something I'm proud of. And I got that way because I've made so many mistakes. And during those mistakes, I developed a fabulous skill of unpicking. The great thing about being a skilled unpicker is it is a skill you can use any stage of sewing. You can as readily use the skill of unpicking when you take out a zipper as you can just sewing a straight line. And when we look at sewing this way, it can kind of transfer into our own life, the way we look at our life. Life is definitely not a walk from point A to point B. Life, like sewing, is a dance. And the better we are at looking at our mistakes as a time to develop the skill of repairing our mistakes, the more likely we are to quickly admit our mistakes and be less discouraged by them. When people are really discouraged by mistakes they make, they're more likely to hide those mistakes, not only from themselves, but from others. And in the process, those mistakes become larger and larger. I think in sewing, we should look for a time, not when we cease to make mistakes, but when our mistakes just don't discourage us so much. So, none of this is to say that you shouldn't try to stop making mistakes. In fact, I recently read somewhere, a person suggested that you should keep a little journal, which I've started to do. Here's my little sewing journal, where I write down things I've learned so I don't repeat the same mistakes. So now that we've talked about some of the mental techniques you can use to ward off frustration, which frustration is a skilled sewer's number one enemy, we're ready to talk about some of the techniques you can employ to use this guy, this little fellow, to his greatest potential. So I'm going to show you some techniques here. First of all, let's talk about kind of the anatomy of the seam ripper. Right up at the tip is not a blade. People naturally want to unpick stitches by using the very tip. However, the little tip is meant to easily slide right under the stitches. The cutting is actually done here in the back, sort of the back of the mouth of the tool. That's where the cutting happens. A lot of times people naturally try and cut stitches up at the tip of the seam ripper. Once a stitch is cut, then you're welcome to use the little tip to pull those stitches out. Now, the way I unpick stitches is I'll come to the wrong side of the fabric, unpick a stitch or two, and then I will open it up to the right side of the fabric and find my hole. Here, it's easy to see the stitches like the rungs of a ladder. We're going to take our seam ripper. Now, I usually kind of try and hold my fabric tight with my fingers like this and take my seam ripper in, so I'm pulling on those stitches, and I'll grab a stitch and keep pulling. Sometimes I'll try and get 2 or 3 stitches at once and keep pulling. And you see how that tightness of the fabric pulls out stitches as you unpick. And it makes the job really quick. Another way I found to kind of fight off frustration in sewing is to time myself on things that I am afraid are taking too much time. And frequently I will time myself on seam ripping, and it takes a surprisingly short amount of time. Okay, you get the picture. Now, one other trick is that you don't always have to unpick. There are certain fabrics that are really sturdy that you can just kind of pull out stitches. And the reason you can do that is the fabric is actually stronger than the thread. So if I was trying to unpick this denim seam, I would start by unpicking my back stitch at the beginning and the end, like so. I think I'd open it right up and get these stitches. Just till I get past that back stitch. And then, because the fabric is so strong, you can just pull it apart. It doesn't do any damage to a denim fabric or a canvas or other sturdy fabrics. You could never do that on a thinner, less sturdy fabric, or it would leave holes. All right, so let's move on to talking about pinning. Now, pinning, like most skills in sewing, if we can learn how to do it correctly from the beginning, it will be a benefit to us all the years that we sew. Now, the first rule with pinning is never leave piles of pins around. I try and teach my students from the very first day of sewing, pins are either in a pin cushion or they're in our fabric. This is just for safety and cleanliness, but mainly for safety because pins have a way of falling off a counter, landing pointy side up in the carpet, and I have stepped on a pin right through my toe. It was incredibly painful. So I've only made that mistake once. It only takes once. So pins are either in our pin cushion or in our fabric. Now, the process of pinning is simple. It looks fast when somebody puts it in fabric, but there's kind of a few steps. So the steps of pinning, we're going to come in at an angle, like so. And once our pin has made it through both layers of our fabric, we're going to push the pin head down and push it forward, like so. I'll do it again, just so you can watch that. We're gonna go in. That guy's a little bent. We won't use that one. Okay, we'll go in. I can tell I made it through both layers of fabric, so I'm gonna push my pin head down and push it forward. Now, I have found that children have a really hard time learning this, even some youth. And so one technique, if you're helping a child learn how to pin, is you can just kind of make a bit of a fold in your fabric and let them put a pin right through like that. The problem with it is it tends to take a bigger bite of fabric. It is always stronger if you can get just a little smaller bite. So now, the way we pin our fabric depends on what we are about to do. If this is our sewing line, I always put my pins in perpendicular to my sewing line. It's so great in sewing sometimes to show my students that math words really do get used in the real world. So that word, you know, we dusted it off, perpendicular. My pins are going to go perpendicular to my sewing line. Now, there are a lot of sewers who are fabulous sewers who pin parallel or right on their sewing line. And I am going to show you why I don't like that method for myself. As we sew on this line, you can see how easy it is to stop my machine, pull out my pin, and put it right in my pin cushion. Now, if there are times that it's important to sew over our pins, we can sew right over them. If we were to put our pins in parallel or right on our sewing line, you can see it's impossible to sew over these pins, and it makes it more difficult to pull out. You have to kind of pull your arm in more to pull them out. Frequently, also, people will accidentally sew the wrong way and have the head of the pin coming in toward the needle, which will make it extra hard to get that pin out. So I'm going to show you here with this pattern on this fabric. If I was preparing to cut this fabric, I would take my pins and put it around the perimeter of my fabric parallel to the cutting line, which would mean right here, my pin would go this way, and over here this way. Now, we try to avoid putting pins inside the area of our pattern because anytime you pin, there's a chance you'll create damage with your fabric. And when we pin, we would like to keep our pins inside the seam allowance of our sewing so that all the damage is not going to be visible if there's any damage from our pin. Now, for those of you who the word seam allowance is a new word, let me just quickly explain. A seam allowance is the distance from where we sew to the cut edge of our fabric. Typically with clothing, a seam allowance is 5/8 inch wide. So I explain to my students, once again, you know, real world uses of math here. 4/8 is a 1/2 inch. So 5/8 is just a little bigger than a 1/2 inch. And it's a pretty large seam allowance with clothing. And the reason I feel like it's a good amount of seam allowance is frequently our sizes change. And with this extra fabric in our seam allowance, we could change a seam if we needed to down the road and still be able to wear the same clothing and kind of let out that seam. So when we're pinning to cut, we want to keep our pins inside the seam allowance, like so. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about cutting. So let's start by talking about the different scissors. Now, I call them scissors, but many people will tell you they're actually called shears. Now, the difference between a scissor and a shear is actually the length of the blade. Shears tend to have longer blades, and the different shape of the thumb holes. So in shears, you have a small hole and a large hole. Scissors, they're both the same. But I generally just refer to them as scissors. So when you're supplying your sewing room, you're going to want a pair of good shears. Now, this is an option, and these are an option. These are really fabulous shears. I love them. They are expensive. In fact, you have to go get an employee to unlock a special cage to get them out. But they're fabulous, and I love them. They're really good for cutting straight for large projects. You also will want smaller ones like this for kind of maneuvering around a little tighter spaces, and you'll definitely want some little clippers. Now, these are great for threads and also great for getting tiny little spaces as you cut. So you're going to want also in your sewing room some paper scissors. Now I'm sure you know already, if you know anyone who sews, you've already learned by making a terrible mistake of thinking you could cut paper with their sewing scissors. You can't. One of the greatest things you can do for your scissors is keep them sharp. And the way you do that is by only cutting fabric with them. Fabric and pattern paper is okay. But you're gonna wanna keep some just normal paper scissors in your sewing room so that you are not tempted to use your fabric scissors. And the last pair of scissors I want to talk to you about are pinking shears. Now, pinking shears are fabulous if you don't have a serger. Generally, people who have sergers, you can either use a serger to sew knits, or they can do a fabulous job of stitching around the edges of woven fabrics. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking to, look back at episode number 3 of Learn to Sew. I talk all about fabrics. So with a woven fabric, we know we're going to get a lot of fraying on those raw edges. So pinking shears, if you don't have a serger to wrap those edges, pinking shears can be used to cut the edges of the fabric. And when we cut those edges, it leaves a sawtooth edge, like so. And what happens here with that edge, it's going to keep the fraying from continually unraveling. It essentially just controls fraying. It doesn't totally prevent it. Right at the valley of, you've got a peak and a valley. Right at the valley, that's generally where your fraying will stop. Now, people do use pinking shears kind of decoratively. You can use them on the edges of felt to make a cute look on craft projects. And sometimes people do it on knits, but it is not necessary to prevent fraying. So one of the most important tips I can give you to help you with cutting is, first of all, to understand how important it is. Now, if seam ripping and the way we think about unpicking is the most important thing to do right in sewing, I would say cutting is the second most important thing. There are very few, I'll say, mistakes that you make sewing that you cannot fix. But mistakes made when cutting frequently cannot be fixed. You'll end up having to run back to the fabric store and buy more fabric if you make serious mistakes when cutting. So take your time. What I found is more time invested in cutting ends up paying off with fabulous projects. I can usually predict how well a project will end up depending on how well it is cut. And a lot of times mistakes we face in sewing or challenges came from just a little bit too hasty cutting. So a couple quick tips for you. Number one, make it as easy for your body as you can to cut. A lot of times I see my students trying to be like Elastigirl and reaching way out on the cutting table and trying to turn their arms in unnatural ways. So let me demonstrate how I would cut something like this. You're going to, I'd pin it more, but we'll just jump right in. You're going to cut right on that line, nice and carefully, right on our cutting line, okay? We'd bring our fabric toward us to make it easier for us so we're not leaning too far into the cutting table. Right here we have a little double notch, which I would cut like so. We'll kind of move that out of the way to make it easier for us. Every step we try and think of how to make it easier for us to cut accurately. Now this is when a lot of people just want to turn the corner and keep going. But let me show you how I would cut this. I would take my fabric and turn it. Reorganize it, lay it flat. So this makes it easy. I usually overcut my corners so then we can get right onto that fabric, that pattern edge, and cut straight. Anytime you can make it easy for your arms to go straight forward, that's where you will get your best cutting. So one other tip I have for you is to bubble cut anytime you're dealing with a small pattern. When we're cutting a small pattern piece, this right here is the leg of a doll. A lot of people would just jump right in and cut this, but the first steps I would do is a bubble cut. Just kind of generally cut this out for yourself. Now this is the size of fabric you're going to want to use to cut really tight pattern pieces. And at this point I would switch scissors to a little smaller shear, and that way you can manipulate it very nicely and turn it as you cut it, like so. All right, we're going to talk about marking tools now. Now, some of you probably saw my line here, my red line here, and thought that I had drawn on my fabric with a marker. Well, you're kind of right, but it's a special marker. It is a heat-sensitive pencil, a heat-sensitive marker, excuse me. So you can draw on your fabric, and then when you heat it with an iron, it will disappear. Now, I say it will disappear on most fabrics, and you're definitely going to want to test your fabric. So it disappears on this completely. But I did notice I tested it on this little silky fabric. It's a polyester, and it did not disappear entirely. So I'm going to demonstrate to you. I got these pens just on Amazon. They came in a variety of colors, and I do find them quite useful. What I generally do is just make sure when I'm using these that it's in my seam allowance, and so even if it does leave a mark, it won't do any damage to my actual projects. So I'll draw a line on both, and then we're going to iron them so you can see for yourself what happens. It doesn't actually take much heat to get our lines to disappear. And they disappear almost instantly. But watch what happens on our pink fabric. It disappears, but there's the faintest little grease line there. So that's why you always have to test your marking tools. Now I have a handful of other options to show you. Some of my other favorite tools are, first of all, a water-soluble graphite pencil. These are fabulous for drawing on especially lighter colored fabrics like so. Now, if I am drawing on a darker colored fabric, what I almost always go to is just a bar of soap. This is a typical soap that you use in your shower, and when it gets really thin, I use it to draw lines. Now, you can actually sharpen it a little bit if you'd like. You just shave it on both edges, like so. And it gives a nice sharp edge on our soap. It gives us a nice sharp line that is always going to wash out of your fabric. Another option you have is a chalk. They come in different colors and types. This is a chalk pencil, and you can remove, you can take out and change colors and put the chalk back in. So this makes a nice line as well. That should wash out of most fabrics. So two more options you have for marking tools. This is my students, one of their favorites. It is carbon paper and tracing wheels. So these are the tracing wheels. My son saw these and thought that they were weapons. And I just love raising boys. One of them actually asked me if I could get them sharpened. But I explained these are actually awesome sewing tools. The way we use carbon paper and tracing wheels is we take our paper out. I ordered this on Amazon. You can get it many other places. It comes in a variety of colors, okay? We'll use the red here, and you're going to put the color to the wrong side of your fabric. Now this is actually a pattern for a face mask. Some ladies in my area had the goal of making 500 face masks, and so I was taking part of that, and so I had one extra to show you, and this is how I marked the darts. I set my carbon paper on the wrong side of my fabric so that you kind of make a sandwich, and you're going to lay your pattern on top and simply take your tracing wheel. I think this pokey one is actually a little better. And you're just going to outline your darts or whatever line you're marking. It doesn't leave really strong lines, but just enough that you can see what you need to sew. And the wonderful thing is, it does it on both at the same time. Both of these are marked. So the last marking tool I want to tell you is called a TAILOR'S TACK. Now this is the old school marking tool. Like if you know an elderly woman who sews, she's a pro at tailor tacks. And there is good reason, they're quite useful. I would say especially for fabrics like lace or tulle, it's really hard to get marks to show up on lace and tulle. And so what you're gonna wanna use is thread to mark your fabric. I'm not gonna show you on this because it's a little hard for the camera to pick up. I'm going to show you how to do a tailor tack on this fabric. Now I've chosen a really bright thread color just so you can see well. For example, say we wanna make a dot. Mark a dot. What you're going to do is take a stitch, just a small stitch that goes through both layers of fabric. We're gonna pull it out and leave about 2 inches of thread. And then we're gonna come back, do a loop, and do it exactly the same again. And leave about 2 inches once again. And we'll cut that off right about there. What we can now do is separate our fabrics like so. And that loop keeps them from coming completely apart. We cut this, and now we have a mark exactly the same on both layers of fabric. Now I would use tailor tacks anytime I was trying to sew on something that you just couldn't find another marking tool to use, especially lace and tulle, just because they stay pretty well and they're so easy to see. So one of the best tips I can give you to help improve your cutting skills is to make it easy on your body. So a lot of times we just cut on top of a kitchen table because that's the best space we have. But it's difficult because kitchen tables are lower. They're meant to be the perfect height for sitting, not for standing. And if you have a table that's closer to your waist height, it makes it easier for you to cut accurately. Now, I know that's difficult because it can be expensive, but I wanted to show you this cutting board only cost me $165 to make. Now, I am taller than your average woman, and so it's a little short on me, but for most people, it will be the perfect height. The way I made this table is I bought these 12 by 12 inch cube organizers. They have 9 cubes. It costs $45 each, and I got 2 of them. And then I topped it with a 3/4 inch laminate board that I had cut to the correct size at the Home Depot. And the last thing I did was cover the laminate board with an adhesive marble laminate, just to make it look nice. It wasn't essential, but it did make it look nice. So this is a perfect cutting table. It's a great space for you to do your projects, to lay them out so you have everything right in front of you. The other thing I love about this system is that it makes space for you to store your fabric scraps. And the way I have it organized in my home studio is I have scrap by color. And so my blue box has all different kinds of blue scraps in it. And my green bucket has all different kinds of greenish scraps in it. And so on and so on. It's a great place to organize and to give your table the height you need. Now I'm going to add pictures so you can see my home studio. I have a version of these at my home studio. The only difference is I ordered countertops from the Home Depot. It was brushed steel. They are fairly expensive, but I've had them for many years and they do not have a single scratch on them. They are fabulous. The only other difference is that I attached to one end of my countertop, and I made this just a homemade ironing board that can fold down and fold up whenever it's needed. Now, if there's a fair amount of interest, I could do a tutorial on how to make a homemade ironing board. Ironing boards that are sold in stores are really not large enough and they get in the way. And so a foldable ironing board attached to a cutting table is really so useful. So I hope we have given you everything you need to get started sewing. Please tune in for Learn to Sew episode number 5. We are actually going to sew a project. I'm so excited. It's going to be a beginner project. And I want to thank the wonderful people at Hive Channel 5 for filming and broadcasting us. Thanks so much.